There are 118 elements in the world, in the universe rather. Now, the larger the element gets, the less likelihood of it to exist in nature, and many of these large elements actually are man-made elements that have been created in laboratories around the world. Now, what distinguishes one element from the other? What distinguishes one from the other is the uniqueness of the atoms of which that element is made. Every atom of every element is unique, and what makes them unique is the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons are in the center of the atom, and that place is called the nucleus. Inside the nucleus, you have protons and neutrons. Electrons basically are found around that center in different regions of the atom surrounding the nucleus. And while that is very hard to know exactly where, we usually depict it with this sort of concentric circles. Electrons. Protons carry a positive charge, electrons carry a negative charge, and neutrons do not have a charge. They are neutral. Now, in an atom by definition is neutral, so the charge should be zero. Well, if protons carry a positive charge of, let's say, positive 6 in a carbon atom, then the number of electrons must match the number of protons, such that positive 6 and a negative 6 makes it a 0. So, in a neutral atom, the number of protons is equal to the number of electrons. Continuing with the example of carbon, we have a carbon atom with 6 protons, 6 electrons, but the number of neutrons can be different. For smaller atoms, the number of neutrons usually is equal or very close to the number of protons, but as the atom becomes larger, the number of neutrons increases faster than the number of protons. For carbon, we have carbon with 6 neutrons. There is also carbon with 7 neutrons and carbon with 8 neutrons. The number of protons can never change. It will always be 6. And to balance the charge of protons, the number of electrons will also be 6 in a neutral atom. Now, how do we call each of these versions of carbon? We call them isotopes. Isotopes are atoms of the same element with different number of neutrons. Carbon's isotopes are carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. Where did I get these numbers? 12, 13, 14. The number 12 is the sum of the protons and the neutrons, 6 plus 6. The number 13 is the sum of protons plus neutrons for that isotope, 6 plus 7. And finally, carbon 14 is produced from the sum of proton 6 plus 8 neutrons. So if you were to find a carbon atom, it would be one of these 3 atoms. Beyond writing them down in this form, we have something called the atomic symbol, where we can write down, let's say, carbon as C, and to the upper left we have the number of protons and neutrons. Basically, if it is carbon 12, the 12 would be up there, and the number of protons goes down there to the lower left. Here is the symbol for carbon 13. And here is carbon 14. we know that the bottom number, the number on the lower left, is the number of protons, but because the number of protons defines what an atom is, we also call it the atomic number. Remember that atoms may have different number of neutrons, so a neutron really does not define what an atom is, but it's the protons. So this is the atomic number. One more property of atoms is their mass. The mass of an atom comes from protons and neutrons particularly. Electrons are about 1800 times less massive than protons and neutrons. Protons and neutrons both carry approximately the same mass, although the neutrons are just a little bit heavier. Electrons, on the other hand, are 1800 times less massive than protons and neutrons. So when we are taking the sum of the protons and neutrons, we are effectively taking the sum of their mass. And that's why the number on the upper left is called the mass number. It is not exactly the mass, because remember, while electrons don't weigh much, they have a little mass, but it very closely approximates the mass. So it's also called the mass number. There is a symbol for the atomic number, and that is Z, and there is a symbol for the mass number, and that is A. If you were ever asked about an element, and let's say I have element X, some hypothetical element, and I say it has the number 8 here and the number 16 up here. What is this element? What is the number of protons? What is the number of neutrons? And what is the number of electrons? So the number of protons would equal to the number on the lower left, which is 8, because that is the atomic number, which is also the same as the number of protons. The number of neutrons is the top number 16 minus the bottom number. Remember, the top number is the sum of protons and neutrons, while the bottom number is just the number of protons. So 16 minus 8 is 8. That is the number of neutrons. And because the element is neutral, the atom is neutral, the number of electrons must equal the number of protons. So we would also have 8 electrons. Now what is this element? What is X? How do I figure that out? You would look on the periodic table, and on the periodic table you would look for the number 8. On the periodic table, every element is numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And when you look at 8, you will see that that element is oxygen.